Welcome to the Connected Mom podcast. Usually we have a guest on the show with me and we have conversations that help you connect more deeply with God, more empathetically with other friends, and more intentionally with your child. But during this season, this is our special book club season where we are going through the book together, Cultivating Deeper Connections in a Lonely World. In our first session, we talked about how loneliness is at an all-time high. In fact, the Surgeon General reported that 1 out of every 2 Americans feel significantly lonely every week. And so God calls us out of our loneliness because his desire is for us to have deeply connected relationships. Throughout the rest of the book, we're going to be looking at some of the one another statements that are found in the New Testament. And so this week we're in chapter 2 and we're looking at the verse that's found in 1 Peter 5:18. It says, "Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another." As I've been thinking about this, I am reminded of a story that took place many years ago when Steve and I were first married. You know, it has been said about people that there are 2 types of people in the world. One comes into the room and says, "Here I am," and wants all the attention. Another one comes into the room and says, "There you are." Well, anyway, back to my story. When Steve and I were first married, we were pastoring a little tiny church. And a few months into our marriage, a big time evangelist who had been on the radio called my husband Steve and said, "Hey, I want to come preach at your church this Sunday." Well, Steve thought, wow, this is awesome. I'm going to call the radio stations. I'm going to get the word out. Turns out that this evangelist had grown up in our town and he had learned to play the organ in our church, our little country church. Now, our church was small. We only had about 50 people at the time, and it was in a farming community, and people lived very humble lives. But Steve was all excited about this gentleman coming to preach, so he called all the radio stations and he got the word out about this big famous preacher that was going to come preach in our church. Well, that Sunday came and the church was packed and Steve was all excited. Now, for starters, the visiting evangelist arrived 20 minutes late into the service. Steve was nearly panicked by the time he got there. He went up and he preached, and then we invited him and his wife back to our home in the little parsonage for Sunday dinner. Now, I was a little bit nervous at that point, and so I had invited an older friend and her husband to join us for dinner because she was a really good cook. So we sat down in the living room before dinner, and the big time evangelist started talking. And he started saying to our friends, "Well, as you know, I'm going to be preaching in Madison Square Garden. And as you know, I was just on the radio with this person. And as you know, next I'm going to be debating this well-known atheist." And he kept going on and on with "as you know." Well, our friend he was a new Christian, and after a while, he said, "You know, before today, I never even heard of you." At this point, the gentleman's mouth, the evangelist's mouth, dropped wide. His wife said, "How dare you talk to my husband that way?" And there was a great bit of tension in the room. I did the only thing I knew to do, which was to get up and make coffee. The 2 gentlemen went outside, and our friend said to this well-known evangelist, "You know, you came here and you never asked me one question about who I was or what I did. All you did was talk about yourself." To the evangelist's credit, he did apologize. But I think that story illustrates the point that Peter was making when he said that we are to clothe ourselves with humility. Here's the thing. If you want deeper connections, if you want closer friendships, if you want better relationships, you've got to clothe yourself with humility, because nobody wants a friend that comes in as the expert. Nobody wants a friend who does all the talking in the conversation. People want to be able to talk about themselves as well. And I think in order to have the deeper friendships that we're all looking for, we've got to make a return to this quality called humility. How would I define humility? I would define humility as having a good handle on knowing yourself, knowing what your gifts are, knowing what your strengths are, but then also your ability to be able to focus on others. Let me ask you a few questions. When you're with a friend, do you lean in to listen to them and ask about their life? Or are you just doing all the talking? Because that's a key question when you think about humility. Philippians 2 describes Jesus as coming with humility. And Paul in that passage calls us to put on humility just like Jesus. We're to have the same attitude that Jesus had. Even though he existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God something to latch onto. Instead, he was willing to become a servant. So in your relationships and in mine, in your friendships and in mine, what does it look like to be humble? That's a good question. I think it starts with the ability to be vulnerable with your friends, to admit that you don't have it all together at all times. You know, I don't like being with friends who only want to know what I need prayer for and they're not willing to tell me what they need prayer for. It's got to be mutual. That's part of putting on humility. When you put on humility and you're willing to be vulnerable, you're willing to say, hey, I don't have my life all together, but I so appreciate you in our friendship. I love what you bring to my life. You're willing to not be the expert on all things. Have you ever been with somebody who wants to be the expert on everything, no matter what the topic? It gets a little annoying after a while, doesn't it? That's not humility. Humility says, I'm here to love you well, and I'm here to serve you. That's another way we can put on humility, is we can come into our relationships with the heart of a servant. Maybe for you, that looks like bringing a meal to a friend who's been sick in bed, or bringing a meal to a woman who's just had a baby, or coming alongside and giving a gift card to somebody who has just maybe lost their job and doesn't know where their next meal is going to come from. How are you willing to serve, or are you always looking to be served? Another way we can put on humility is to learn to ask for help when we need it. I know a young couple in our church, and they have taken in a bunch of foster kids, and they are doing remarkable work. They love on these foster kids, but they will get calls like late at night. Hey, we have some kids we have to bring to your house right away. And a lot of times they don't have what they need for those kids. And they have learned to ask the church community for help when they need it. Maybe it's for help to get a set of bunk beds, or maybe it's for help with clothes or diapers or whatever they need. They're willing to ask for help. And then people that are humble restrain themselves. They restrain themselves from trying to fix other people. Rather than giving advice, they've learned to listen and be curious. Listen, if you can solve somebody's problem in 1 minute, that basically makes them an idiot. And nobody wants to think of themselves as an idiot, right? So instead, learn to restrain yourself. You don't need to give advice for everybody's problem. You don't need to be the fixer. And then learn to invite feedback. How am I coming across to you? What would you like to see me change? How do you view me as a listener? That's a vulnerable question, but I dare you to ask the people that are closest to you. Because if you want deep relationships, you've got to put on humility. Listen, in our journey to cultivate these deeper relationships, we've got to go back to the Word of God, which has a lot of principles for us as one another. It has a lot of principles for us to develop and cultivate the kind of friendships we want. And one of them is to embrace humility. I hope you've enjoyed today's session. And hey, if you've enjoyed this, would you share it with a friend? Because maybe they'd like to go through the book, Cultivating Deeper Connections, with one of their friends. I will join you again next week with another episode that will go along with how we're going to cultivate deeper friendships, how we're going to cultivate deeper connections in our lonely world so that we can move beyond loneliness and live the life that God has intended us to live. So thanks for joining me today, and we'll talk again next week where I'll share another principle for you to cultivate those deeper connections.